story begins in Hyde, a small working-class town just outside Manchester. To the people who lived there, Dr. Harold Shipman was not just a doctor, he was their doctor. The trusted local GP, the man who made home visits, who wrote prescriptions, who sat in their living rooms with a calm authority. He wore the white coat, he carried the stethoscope, and he carried decades of trust. But behind that calm exterior was a darkness no one could have imagined, because in his hands the act of care became a weapon. What patients thought was medical attention turned out to be their last moment alive. By the late 90s, people noticed that too many patients, particularly older women, were dying suddenly after seemingly routine checkups or short house calls. Mothers, grandmothers, women in their 60s, 70s, even 50s. Many of them described as lively and in good health. And yet, they were found lifeless in their armchairs, on their sofas, in their beds, almost always alone, and almost always soon after a visit from their doctor. The town grieved, but no one connected the dots. Not at first. Death seemed natural for the elderly, and who would question a GP who signed the certificate? Shipman himself often wrote them, marking old age or natural causes with the casual stroke of his pen. But then came Kathleen Grundy, a wealthy, energetic 81-year-old widow. She had been seen jogging around town, volunteering, full of energy. When she died suddenly in June 1998, it shocked her family. And then the will surfaced. A strange, handwritten document that left nearly all of her estate, valued at over £350,000 to one man. Not her children, not charities, not friends. To her doctor. To Harold Shipman. Her daughter, a lawyer, knew immediately something was wrong. She contacted authorities, and Grundy's body was exhumed. The results confirmed her suspicions. Her mother's bloodstream contained lethal levels of diamorphine, a powerful opioid that Shipman routinely had access to in his practice. This discovery cracked the facade wide open. Police began digging into his other patients. They found altered records, overwritten notes, and patterns that were impossible to ignore. Deaths clustered tightly around Shipman's visits. His reputation as a trusted community doctor was collapsing into something unthinkable, the possibility that he was Britain's most prolific serial killer. Families began to question everything, every signature, every home visit, every sudden passing they had once accepted. How many deaths had really been natural? And how many had been orchestrated by the man they trusted the most? This was no longer just a case about one suspicious will. It was the start of one of the largest murder inquiries in British history. And as the investigation widened, the staggering scale of what Shipman had done would horrify the world. When detectives first dug into Harold Shipman's files, what they uncovered didn't just raise suspicions, it detonated them. Medical charts were altered, computer entries backdated, and notes added after patients had already died. The patterns became undeniable. The sudden deaths always occurred when Shipman was present, often during home visits where he was the only witness to the final moments. Investigators soon learned that Shipman had a near unchecked supply of diamorphine, also known as pharmaceutical heroin. He was meant to prescribe it sparingly for terminal cancer pain. Instead, he was quietly administering it to healthy or relatively stable patients, doses so overwhelming that they were instantly fatal. And when the families asked questions, Shipman, calm, almost arrogant, signed the death certificates himself. The trial began in 1999, focusing on just 15 charges of murder and one count of forgery, the forged will of Kathleen Grundy. The courtroom was packed, with grieving families filling the benches, waiting for answers. Prosecutors laid out their case. Shipman had used his position of trust, the access of a GP, to kill patients in their own homes, then falsify records to cover his tracks. The evidence was devastating. Computer logs showed how he had entered symptoms after deaths to make them look natural. Nurses and relatives testified to the healthy condition of victims just before their sudden collapse. The forged will tied him directly to financial motive, but experts argued his true motive went deeper. It wasn't just money, it was control. The ability to decide life and death. The jury deliberated only a matter of days. In January 2000, Harold Shipman was found guilty on all counts. The judge gave him 15 life sentences, one for each life the jury could prove beyond doubt he had taken, and added that he should never be released. But everyone knew the truth. 15 was only the beginning. Later inquiries estimated Shipman may have killed over 200 patients, making him the most prolific serial killer in modern British history. Families demanded answers. Not only about Shipman, but about the system that had failed them. How could so many deaths, signed off by the same doctor, have gone unquestioned? The Shipman inquiry, chaired by Dame Janet Smith, examined thousands of medical records. It confirmed what many feared. His crimes stretched back decades, hidden in plain sight by the trust people placed in a white coat. For the families, justice felt incomplete. The official list of confirmed victims could never capture the true scale of the loss. For every name, there were others left uncertain, questions left unanswered. To this day, relatives continue to fight for acknowledgement, to have their loved ones officially recognized as part of Shipman's tally. Shipman never expressed remorse. In 2004, he died by suicide in his prison cell, taking with him the full truth of his motives and victim count. For the survivors, that final act felt like another theft, not just of lives, but of answers. And as the inquiry closed, Britain was left with a haunting realization. Sometimes, the most dangerous predator doesn't lurk in the shadows. He sits in your living room, holding your wrist, checking your pulse, wearing the mask of care. Hospitals are supposed to be places of healing, but when Charles Cullen worked the night shift, they became something else entirely. Colleagues would later recall a pattern. Patients who were stable at evening rounds suddenly crashed without warning in the early hours. Resuscitation teams would be called, alarms would blare, and yet the mortality numbers didn't make sense. Too many unexpected deaths, too many bad luck cases clustered around one man's shifts. Cullen was a registered nurse, soft-spoken, unassuming, and often described as a loner. On paper, he was competent. In reality, he was orchestrating medical horror. He developed a chilling method, tampering with IV bags, injecting lethal doses of insulin, digoxin, or other drugs into saline. The bag would then be hung for the next nurse, who unknowingly delivered the poison. Other times, Cullen directly injected patients under the guise of routine care. For years, these deaths slipped through the cracks. Hospitals wrote off anomalies as coincidences or medical complications. Mortality spikes weren't always flagged, and administrators quietly encouraged Cullen to resign when questions arose, protecting the institution's reputation instead of confronting the truth. Each time he moved hospitals, a trail of suspicious deaths followed. By his own later admission, he worked at more than a dozen facilities across New Jersey and Pennsylvania, leaving chaos at each stop. The scope of the problem started to emerge when statisticians began looking at mortality clusters. Data showed spikes. Nights when Cullen was on duty, the death rate surged. Investigators later confirmed this wasn't random noise. It was an unmistakable signature. Still, Cullen was careful. He targeted patients who were vulnerable, often the elderly or critically ill. That way, when they suddenly coded, it could be blamed on their condition. But nurses began whispering. Why do so many patients die when he's on? One remembered finding a half-used syringe near an IV port that didn't belong. Another noticed he always volunteered for certain rooms, certain shifts. Suspicion grew, though evidence was frustratingly thin. By the early 2000s, Cullen's quiet reign of terror had stretched nearly 2 decades. Estimates of his victims would eventually range from 30 to more than 300, making him one of the deadliest healthcare killers in history. But at this stage, it was still rumor and data points, whispers in staff lounges, unexplained crashes, families left with grief and no answers. Behind it all was a man who later claimed he was easing suffering. But the pattern was clear. This wasn't mercy. It was compulsion. It was control. The night shift had become his hunting ground, and no one yet had the proof to stop him. By the early 2000s, Charles Cullen's quiet trail of death had stretched across multiple hospitals. Administrators suspected, staff whispered, but no one had ever pinned him down. That changed at Somerset Medical Center in New Jersey. After yet another cluster of sudden, unexplained cardiac arrests, the hospital finally called in law enforcement. Detectives soon discovered what so many facilities had ignored. Whenever Cullen worked, mortality soared. The problem? Proving it. Patients who died were already fragile. Autopsies often showed nothing unusual. And Cullen had learned to hide his tracks, selecting drugs that metabolized quickly, leaving little trace. Investigators needed someone inside, someone who could see what he was doing in real time. That someone was Amy Loughran, a fellow nurse and one of Cullen's closest friends. Detectives approached her with a shocking suggestion. They believed her colleague was murdering patients. At first, she refused to believe it. Cullen was quiet, even awkward, but he had shown her kindness. They had shared confidences on break, laughed over cafeteria meals. Could he really be killing people behind that soft exterior? Still, Amy agreed to help. Wearing a wire, she met Cullen outside of work, probing gently, trying to see if he would reveal anything. Her voice trembled as she asked questions about the deaths, about the strange drug orders. Cullen didn't admit outright, but his words hinted at guilt, his tone evasive. Detectives built their case, pharmacy records showing drugs signed out under his login, anomalies in patient charts, clusters lining up perfectly with his shifts. Finally, in December 2003, Cullen was arrested. Confronted with the mountain of evidence and Amy's cooperation, he cracked. What followed was one of the most chilling confession arcs in American legal history. Cullen admitted to dozens of killings, calmly describing how he spiked IV bags or injected patients, often without remorse. When pressed for numbers, his estimate was staggering. Prosecutors later said he may have murdered over 40, while investigators feared the real toll was well into the hundreds. In court, families filled the gallery, demanding answers. One by one, Cullen pled guilty to 29 murders and 6 attempted murders across several counties. He was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms, a punishment so severe that parole would never be possible. Amy's courage became the backbone of both the investigation and the later book and film, The Good Nurse. Without her, Cullen might never have been caught. To this day, his case stands as both a warning and a scar. How one man, protected by institutional silence, was able to kill for nearly 2 decades, and how it finally took a friend's bravery to end it. In the early 2000s, hospitals in northern Germany began noticing something strange. At Oldenburg Clinic and later at Delmenhorst Hospital, a young nurse named Niels Högel seemed to be in the middle of an extraordinary run of bad luck, or so it appeared. Patients who were stable just hours earlier would suddenly collapse into cardiac arrest. Resuscitation alarms, the dreaded code blues, became almost routine on his shifts. At first, colleagues chalked it up to coincidence. After all, hospitals deal with fragile patients every day. But whispers started forming in the corridors. Why was it that crashes happened disproportionately when Högel was on duty? Why did he always seem to be right there when the alarms went off, sometimes even before others noticed? The answer lay in his pocket. Investigators would later learn that Högel carried syringes preloaded with drugs that could trigger sudden cardiac arrest. He favored medications like ajmaline, a powerful antiarrhythmic, which in the wrong dosage caused a patient's heart to spiral out of control. Then, as chaos erupted, Högel would rush in, playing the role of the heroic savior. He thrived on the adrenaline of resuscitation, on the spotlight of being the one to step forward. But his streak of rescue attempts raised suspicion. Some colleagues privately nicknamed him Rissus Niels. Others felt uneasy about the sheer number of incidents. Parents and relatives of patients asked questions doctors struggled to answer. Why had their loved ones suddenly deteriorated? Why were so many deaths unexplained? Finally, in 2005, a co-worker caught him in the act, standing over a patient with a syringe, moments before yet another cardiac arrest. This time, the staff intervened. The patient survived, and Högel's mask began to slip. The hospital launched an internal investigation, but by then, dozens of families had already buried loved ones under suspicious circumstances. Police became involved, and suspicions deepened into evidence. Charts showed a pattern: the spikes in deaths, the endless code blues, the recurring presence of one nurse. What had seemed like medical misfortune started to look more like systematic sabotage. Högel was arrested, and the first questions the detectives asked set the tone for what would become one of Europe's most horrifying medical murder cases. How many patients had actually died at his hands? How many collapses had been staged for his own twisted sense of heroism? The answers would emerge only slowly, through data, exhumations, and a painstaking timeline. But already, Germany was bracing for the possibility that they were dealing with their most prolific serial killer since the war. When Niels Högel was finally behind bars, investigators faced a chilling task: untangling his true victim count. This wasn't a case where the bodies lined up neatly, or where a single crime scene told the story. Högel had worked across 2 hospitals for years, and in that time, patients died quietly, often cremated without autopsy, their records reduced to a few scribbled notes in medical charts. German prosecutors realized they needed something radical: data science applied to death. Analysts combed through thousands of hospital records, plotting survival rates against staffing schedules. The results were stark. Mortality spiked dramatically on the nights and days when Högel was on duty, then plummeted when he wasn't. In one ward, patients were more than twice as likely to suffer cardiac arrest if Högel's name appeared on the rota. Exhumations began. Graves were reopened across Lower Saxony, and toxicologists searched for traces of ajmaline and other cardiac drugs. Families stood by in anguish as coffins were lifted, their grief reopened for the sake of truth. Again and again, lab reports confirmed suspicions, lethal overdoses where none should have existed. But even with these efforts, the numbers blurred. Officially, Högel was convicted in connection with more than 85 murders, making him the most prolific killer in modern German history. Yet investigators quietly admitted the real toll could be closer to 300 patients. Some experts believe the number may never be fully known, because cremation had destroyed vital evidence. In court, the spectacle was haunting. Högel, a stocky man with a disarming grin, sat in the dock while relatives of the dead testified. Some asked how he could smile while describing the moment he injected their loved ones. Others demanded answers. Why had he played with lives just to feel the rush of resuscitation? Psychologists framed it as a mix of craving control, addiction to adrenaline, and a warped need to be seen as the hero. He wasn't merciful, as some killers have claimed. He was manipulative, creating crises so he could step in as the savior. The judges were blunt. In 2019, after years of trials and appeals, Niels Högel was sentenced to life in prison, with the harshest designation German law allows, severe gravity of guilt, effectively ruling out early release. Yet even as the gavel fell, one question hung in the air. If colleagues had spoken up sooner, if hospital managers hadn't turned a blind eye, how many hundreds of patients might still be alive today? For Germany, the Högel case wasn't just about one man. It was a mirror held up to an entire medical system, one that had missed or ignored every warning sign until it was too late. In the world of medicine, the image of a doctor slipping something sinister into his colleagues' lunches sounds like the plot of a thriller. But for Michael Swango, it was real life. A trained physician, decorated with the authority of a white coat, Swango carried an obsession with death that shadowed him from one workplace to the next. It began with whispers. At Southern Illinois University during his medical training in the 1980s, fellow students noticed that patients under Swango's care had a troubling tendency to crash suddenly. Professors raised concerns, but instead of halting his career, he was allowed to continue. The pattern only deepened. By the time he landed internships and residencies, strange things happened wherever he went. Nurses swapped stories in hushed tones. If Swango's on call, watch your patients. Elderly patients recovering from routine surgeries inexplicably coded. Families who expected a normal discharge instead walked out of hospitals in mourning. But it wasn't just patients. Swango's own colleagues soon felt his reach. At one hospital, staff noticed that doctors and nurses who ate or drank from the communal break room often fell violently ill. Coffee that tasted bitter, donuts that left colleagues doubled over, even iced tea that triggered violent vomiting. Swango always seemed to be nearby. Some brushed it off as bad luck, but others began connecting dots. The young doctor had a fascination with poisons. Authorities finally caught a break when investigators linked these food poisonings to substances found in Swango's possession. His apartment revealed medical texts about toxicology, as well as clippings of news articles about unexplained hospital deaths. Even his notebooks carried morbid musings about mortality. In 1985, he was convicted for poisoning co-workers with arsenic-laced drinks and spent several years in prison. Most assumed that would be the end of his medical career. But Swango was relentless. He changed his name, altered resumes, and applied to hospitals again and again. Shockingly, institutions overlooked his record, either through poor vetting or sheer desperation for physicians. And so, patients kept dying. The pattern was always the same. A ward would see sudden spikes in cardiac arrests or collapses when Swango was on duty, then quiet down when he was gone. Hospital after hospital dismissed suspicions as coincidence, only realizing too late that they had harbored a predator in scrubs. Swango's crimes weren't committed in shadowed alleys or abandoned buildings. They were carried out under fluorescent lights on hospital wards meant for healing. His poisonings of co-workers were more than cruelty. They were a twisted rehearsal for what he would unleash on patients. And as the paper trail grew, one question would come to dominate his story. How many deaths could have been prevented if the first red flags had been taken seriously? By the early 1990s, Michael Swango was more than a doctor with a troubling past. He was a man trailing a growing body count and an institutional failure that seemed almost unthinkable. Each time his history caught up with him, loopholes, oversights, and misplaced trust allowed him to move on, carrying his poisoned ambition from one hospital to the next. When Swango was released from prison after serving time for poisoning colleagues, most assumed he would never touch medicine again. Yet he knew exactly how to exploit the system. With altered resume and selective omissions, he presented himself as a reformed physician. Some hospitals desperate for staff overlooked his felony conviction. Others failed to dig deep enough into his background. The result? Patients continued to collapse suddenly, and the trail of suspicion followed him from Illinois to Ohio, then across state lines and eventually overseas. It was paperwork, not a dramatic crime scene, that began to close the net. Investigators combed through Swango's applications and found a pattern of lies, employment dates that didn't match, references that couldn't be verified, and medical credentials that were misrepresented. The facade began to crack. The FBI stepped in, working alongside hospitals and international authorities. As they pieced together timelines, they realized Swango's presence correlated with unexplained deaths or medical emergencies at nearly every stop in his career. One internal review noted that whenever Swango transferred to a new ward, mortality rates spiked, then returned to normal after his departure. It wasn't just anecdotal suspicion, the data screamed a pattern. But proving murder inside a hospital is notoriously difficult. Patients are already vulnerable, already battling illness, and overdoses of certain drugs leave little forensic trace. Prosecutors faced the same problem, seen in cases like Charles Cullen and Harold Shipman. How do you prove intent in an environment where death is expected? In 2000, Swango finally entered a plea deal. He admitted to intentionally killing several patients with lethal injections, and prosecutors believed the real number could be far higher, possibly in the dozens. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Yet the story didn't end with his conviction. Swango's case became a chilling study in systemic weakness. Hospitals had failed to share information, hiring boards had failed to cross-check records, and regulators had been too slow to respond. One hospital administrator later admitted, "We should have caught him sooner." For the families of victims, that phrase was unbearable. Their loved ones had trusted a doctor, only to be betrayed by the very system meant to protect them. Swango's crimes revealed that the danger wasn't just in his hands, but in the cracks of oversight that let him slip through again and again. He now spends his days behind bars, but the shadow of his career stretches across continents, a reminder that medicine's white coat can be just as dangerous as it is healing if institutions refuse to act on the warnings. In the early 1980s, at a pediatric ICU in San Antonio, Texas, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Infants who had been stable, even recovering, would suddenly suffer violent medical emergencies. Code blues erupted with alarming frequency. Tiny bodies convulsed, hearts faltered, and parents watched in terror as their newborns were rushed into emergency resuscitation. At the center of nearly every crisis was a nurse named Genene Jones. Colleagues nicknamed the unit's resuscitation kit the crash cart. For most, it was a tool of last resort, rolled in during true emergencies. For Jones, it became a routine prop. Nurses whispered about how often the cart seemed to be in motion during her shifts, how the sound of its wheels squeaking down the hallway had become eerily familiar. Some even joked darkly that if you wanted action, just assign Jones to the case. But behind the gallows humor was growing dread. Children were dying, and nobody could explain why. Jones projected confidence. She often volunteered for the sickest patients, portraying herself as a heroic figure who thrived under pressure. When infants coded, she was the first to leap in, pumping chest compressions, ordering drugs, calling for doctors. To shaken parents, she appeared devoted, almost angelic. But some staff began to notice troubling details. The children who crashed were often not the sickest, not the ones doctors expected to fail. And more than once, syringes with unexplained residue were found near Jones's patients. One physician later admitted he started to feel a pit in his stomach whenever Jones was on duty. The odds didn't add up, he said. The deaths clustered around her, but we didn't yet know how or why. Investigators eventually uncovered that Jones had allegedly been injecting infants with unnecessary, even lethal, drugs. Succinylcholine, a powerful muscle relaxant, and heparin, a blood thinner, appeared repeatedly in suspicious cases. Both drugs could induce sudden collapse, leaving doctors scrambling. and leaving Jones in the spotlight as the nurse who tried to save the child. By 1982, suspicions had grown impossible to ignore. Mortality rates in the ICU were rising at an unprecedented pace. Administrators faced a horrifying possibility. If a nurse was intentionally harming babies, the hospital itself could be implicated. Rather than sound a public alarm, leadership quietly pushed Jones out. She was asked to resign, and shockingly, she soon found work at a nearby clinic in Kerrville. There, the pattern repeated. Healthy infants suddenly coded. Parents began questioning why their children collapsed after routine checkups. Staff noticed that Jones was once again nearby whenever tragedy struck. The phrase, crash cart culture, became shorthand for her reign of terror, a twisted cycle in which Jones created emergencies only to step in as the savior. For prosecutors who later built the case, it was a grotesque form of attention-seeking, with innocent lives sacrificed for her need to be admired. By the time formal investigations began, dozens of babies were dead or left with permanent injuries. And the chilling part was how preventable so many of them might have been if early suspicions hadn't been brushed aside. The stage was set for one of the most controversial and devastating medical trials in Texas history. When Genene Jones left the San Antonio Pediatric ICU under a cloud of suspicion, many assumed the danger was over. But the nightmare had only shifted zip codes. At the Kerrville clinic where she was hired, Jones continued her pattern. Infants who arrived for routine shots or minor checkups collapsed minutes later, their lips turning blue, their tiny bodies seizing. For parents, the horror was unimaginable, healthy babies arriving in their arms, leaving in coffins. By 1983, the whispers had become loud enough that investigators could no longer look away. The deaths and near-deaths weren't random. They aligned too neatly with Jones's shifts, and the drugs involved, especially succinylcholine and heparin, raised alarms. A grand jury was convened. The medical community faced an agonizing question. How many babies had died not from illness, but from the hands of the very nurse entrusted to save them? The trial that followed was groundbreaking. Prosecutors zeroed in on a single infant, Chelsea McClellan, who had collapsed after a routine vaccination at the Kerrville clinic. Autopsy results showed a lethal overdose of succinylcholine. Unlike earlier suspicions at the hospital, this time the science could speak. Jones was indicted, and in 1984 she was convicted of murder. The jury sentenced her to 99 years in prison. But the story didn't end there. Investigators revisited her years in San Antonio, reviewing old death certificates, medical logs, and staff testimonies. The numbers were staggering. Prosecutors believed that Jones might have killed between 40 and 60 infants. Some estimates went even higher. Yet most of those cases would never see court. The forensic evidence from the early 1980s was thin, and without definitive toxicology, prosecutors feared acquittals. Jones also faced conviction in another case, for injuring an infant who survived a collapse. That brought her an additional 60 years. Still, Texas sentencing laws at the time allowed for good behavior credit. To the horror of families, this meant Jones could be eligible for release as early as 2018, after serving only a fraction of her term. When the news broke, outrage swept through Texas. Parents who had buried their babies demanded action. Politicians, under pressure, pushed reforms. The case became a rallying cry for tightening parole laws for violent offenders and for improving oversight of medical professionals. Hospitals were urged to implement stricter mortality tracking and peer reporting systems to prevent another Genene Jones from slipping through the cracks. As Jones's parole date loomed, prosecutors scrambled to bring new charges. They re-examined long cold cases, gathering witness statements and applying modern forensic techniques. In 2017, she was indicted on 5 additional murders from her San Antonio years. Facing trial in her late 60s, Jones finally accepted a plea deal. In 2020, she admitted guilt in those cases and was sentenced to life, effectively ensuring she would never walk free. Families of the victims sat in the courtroom, some clutching faded baby photos. For decades, they had lived with unanswered questions, haunted by the sense that justice had been incomplete. Now, with the new convictions, there was at least certainty that Jones would never again harm another child. Her story left a scar on Texas medicine. The killer nurse became a symbol of institutional failure, of how bureaucracy, fear of scandal, and professional loyalty had allowed a predator to move unchecked. And the legislative changes her case sparked became part of her dark legacy. On the surface, Grantham and Kesteven Hospital in Lincolnshire, England, was the last place anyone expected a nightmare. It was a modest district hospital, and its pediatric ward was meant to be a sanctuary for children, a place of healing, staffed by nurses who projected patience and care. Among them was Beverly Allett, a 22-year-old nurse whose soft-spoken manner earned her a reputation as gentle and trustworthy. But behind the quiet ward's curtains, something was terribly wrong. In February 1991, a string of medical crises began to unfold. Infants and toddlers who were admitted with relatively minor conditions suddenly went into cardiac arrest. Some died, others survived, but with unexplained complications. Parents noticed the pattern first. They whispered to one another in the waiting area. Why were so many children collapsing when they seemed to be improving? Why did it always seem to happen when Nurse Allett was on duty? Doctors, at first, struggled to find an explanation. Medical notes showed no clear underlying cause for the rapid deterioration of these young patients. But the timing was impossible to ignore. In the span of just 2 months, 4 children died and 9 others collapsed under mysterious circumstances. Suspicion turned toward the possibility of insulin overdoses. Tests revealed dangerously low blood sugar levels in some of the children. In one case, a child who had never been diabetic showed insulin readings far beyond what the body could produce naturally. It was the kind of anomaly that demanded answers. But the bigger shock came when pathologists discovered traces of air injected directly into veins, a method of inducing cardiac arrest that left little evidence behind, unless doctors knew to look for it. The clinical anomalies stacked up quickly. A baby recovering well from chest surgery suddenly died without warning. Another child admitted for a stomach bug was resuscitated after a collapse, but later developed severe brain damage. The cases were varied, but the constant was Allett's presence at the bedside. Parents, already consumed by grief, began to speak out. One father recalled leaving his daughter stable and smiling, only to return to find doctors battling to save her life. Others questioned why nurses, especially Allett, were always the ones to discover their children in distress. The coincidences were too many, the explanations too few. By the spring of 1991, whispers turned to accusations. Hospital administrators, now under mounting pressure, initiated an internal review. The results were alarming. Patient charts, lab reports, and staff rosters overlapped in chilling ways. Mortality spikes lined up almost perfectly with Allett's shifts. While some colleagues still struggled to believe a young nurse could be capable of deliberate harm, the weight of evidence was pushing them in one direction. Police were called in. The investigation was slow and methodical, every incident scrutinized, every vial and syringe catalogued. Detectives pieced together a disturbing portrait. Every incident scrutinized, every vial and syringe catalogued. Detectives pieced together a disturbing portrait. Allett had exploited the trust of both families and colleagues, using the very tools of her profession to harm rather than heal. The public didn't yet know the scale of what was happening inside that quiet ward. To parents of the surviving children, it was already too late. Their sons and daughters carried scars, some physical, some invisible, that would never fully fade. For investigators, the question was no longer whether foul play had occurred, but how many children had been victims. And as suspicions hardened, the pediatric ward at Grantham shifted from a place of care to the epicenter of one of Britain's darkest medical scandals. By the time detectives presented their findings to prosecutors in late 1991, the case against Beverly Allett was chilling in its clarity. 13 children had collapsed in just 59 days. 4 had died. The evidence, insulin overdoses, unexplained air bubbles in veins, and a disturbing overlap between medical crises and Allett's shifts, left investigators convinced they were dealing with a predator disguised as a nurse. In November 1991, Allett was formally charged with 4 counts of murder, 11 counts of attempted murder, and a series of counts for grievous bodily harm. It was one of the most extensive criminal indictments ever leveled against a British healthcare worker. Public reaction was swift. Shock gave way to outrage, and outrage to fear. Parents across the UK asked the same question. If this could happen in a trusted pediatric ward, what about their own children's hospitals? The trial opened in 1993 at Nottingham Crown Court. Prosecutors painted Allett as an angel of death, a nurse who craved attention and control, who relished the chaos of medical emergencies she secretly created. They argued that she deliberately induced crises so she could step in as the first responder, basking in the drama of resuscitations. Experts testified that her behavior fit a profile sometimes associated with a rare form of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, except she wasn't harming her own child, but other people's. The defense countered that Alet was mentally unwell. They highlighted her history of fabricated illnesses, self-harm, and attention-seeking behavior long before she became a nurse. Psychiatric reports suggested she suffered from a severe personality disorder. Defense lawyers argued she should be treated, not imprisoned. The jury faced a grim balancing act, weighing the horror of the crimes against the possibility of diminished responsibility. But when the verdicts were read in May 1993, the scale of Alet's guilt was undeniable. She was convicted on 4 counts of murder, 6 of attempted murder, and several more of grievous bodily harm. Instead of a traditional prison sentence, the court ordered her detained at Rampton Secure Hospital, one of the UK's highest security psychiatric institutions. There, she was told she would serve a minimum of 30 years before being eligible for review, effectively a life sentence. For the families of the victims, it was a thin kind of justice. Some felt relieved she would never walk the wards again. Others were outraged she was being treated in a hospital rather than locked away in a prison cell. The aftermath went beyond Alet herself. Her case triggered a sweeping re-examination of how hospitals safeguarded children. Questions were asked in Parliament. Reviews criticized the lack of oversight on pediatric wards, the failure to notice patterns sooner, and the blind trust placed in staff without adequate monitoring. The Alet Inquiry, published in 1994, recommended tighter controls on access to insulin and other high-risk drugs, stricter incident reporting, and better systems for detecting unusual spikes in mortality. Training for nurses and doctors was reshaped to include spotting warning signs of staff misconduct, however unthinkable. For survivors and bereaved families, reforms were little consolation. Many of the children who lived through Alet's attacks required lifelong care. Parents carried the anguish of knowing they had entrusted their child to the very person who inflicted harm. One father, speaking to reporters years later, summed up the wound. "We handed her our children, and she took them away." Beverly Alet remains one of the UK's most infamous medical criminals, her name forever linked with betrayal of the deepest trust. And while policies changed, her legacy lingers as a reminder that even in the safest places, vigilance is never optional. In the mid-1990s, the Northampton Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Massachusetts was supposed to be a sanctuary for those who had already given so much in service to their country. But inside its wards, something ominous was unfolding. Patients who were stable one moment would suddenly crash the next, heart rates spiking, blood pressures plummeting, alarms piercing the quiet halls. And a disturbing pattern emerged. The crises seemed to cluster whenever Kristen Gilbert, a young registered nurse, was on duty. At first, no one wanted to believe it. Colleagues described Gilbert as competent, even charismatic. She joked with staff, won patients' trust, and seemed dedicated to her work. But whispers began to spread. During her shifts, the number of code blue calls, emergencies requiring immediate resuscitation, tripled. Veterans who had been expected to recover were suddenly dying at startling rates. Doctors and nurses began asking themselves, was this coincidence or something more sinister? The suspicion deepened when pharmacists noticed that ampoules of epinephrine, a powerful drug used to restart failing hearts, were disappearing from stockrooms at unusual rates. Epinephrine in controlled doses could save a life, but in large amounts, it could induce cardiac arrest. The very crisis Gilbert always seemed to be first on the scene to treat. Colleagues recalled that she thrived on the adrenaline of emergencies. Some even described her demeanor as oddly excited when alarms rang. But underneath the rush, staff began to feel fear. A quiet consensus grew. Patients weren't safe when Gilbert was around. Nurses quietly swapped shifts to avoid working with her. One doctor later testified that when Gilbert walked onto a ward, staff would exchange nervous glances because they knew the odds of a patient coding had just gone up. Hospital administrators were slow to act. Like so many institutions before them, they hesitated to accuse a trusted professional of unthinkable crimes without hard proof. But whispers grew louder after a chilling moment. One veteran, who survived a collapse, later told investigators he'd felt fine until Gilbert came into his room. And moments later, he was gasping for air. By the mid-1990s, a group of nurses took their suspicions to the Veterans Affairs Police. An investigation began quietly, looking at patient records, medication logs, and staff rosters. Analysts noticed the unmistakable overlap. Unexplained deaths and emergencies coincided overwhelmingly with Gilbert's presence. But suspicion wasn't enough. Investigators needed something concrete, proof that drugs had been misused, that deaths weren't natural. Families, meanwhile, were left in limbo, some grieving veterans who had come to the hospital to heal, only to never come home. Behind the walls of Northampton VA, a terrifying reality was crystallizing. The very nurse sworn to protect life may have been orchestrating death. And with every missing vial of epinephrine, every unexplained cardiac arrest, the circle around Kristen Gilbert tightened. By the late 1990s, the quiet suspicions surrounding Kristen Gilbert had exploded into a full-scale federal case. Investigators compiled rosters, death certificates, and medication logs, and the overlap was undeniable. When Gilbert was on the ward, the mortality rate soared. When she wasn't, it returned to baseline. The missing epinephrine, the clustering of code blues, the colleagues' testimonies, it all painted a chilling picture. But prosecutors knew the stakes were high. Accusing a nurse of turning into a predator in scrubs was almost unthinkable. They had to prove not only that deaths occurred under her watch, but that they were no accident. To build their case, they exhumed veterans' bodies, testing tissue for chemical traces. The results showed unusual levels of epinephrine and other cardiac drugs. Combined with testimony from co-workers who described Gilbert's almost compulsive need to insert herself into emergencies, the foundation for trial was set. In 2000, Gilbert was arrested and charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder. Federal prosecutors took over, arguing that she had deliberately induced cardiac arrests by injecting patients with lethal doses of epinephrine, then rushed to resuscitate them to bask in the drama of saving lives. When patients didn't survive, she became, in effect, the architect of their deaths. Defense attorneys countered that the veterans were elderly and medically fragile, that their deaths could have been natural. They attacked the science, arguing epinephrine occurs naturally in the body, especially under stress, making it difficult to prove overdoses after death. They also painted Gilbert as a scapegoat for a hospital already under scrutiny for poor oversight. But the jury listened closely to those who had worked beside her. Nurses described how they feared for patients when Gilbert was assigned to their floor. One colleague recalled dreading her shifts, convinced she'd walk out to the sound of another code blue. Perhaps most damning was Gilbert's behavior outside the ward. The prosecution presented evidence that after learning she was under investigation, she made a bomb threat to the hospital in an attempt to divert attention. To the jury, this suggested consciousness of guilt, someone desperate to disrupt the inquiry closing in on her. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. Kristen Gilbert was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the families of veterans who had died at Northampton VA, the trial's outcome was bittersweet. Some wept in relief at the confirmation of their suspicions. Others sat stone-faced, unable to comprehend how a nurse entrusted with their loved one's care could betray that trust so completely. "She stole from us the men who survived war only to die in her care," one family member told reporters. The Department of Veterans Affairs responded with sweeping reforms to tighten drug access and oversight on wards, but the damage was done. To this day, many families believe more victims may never have been officially counted. Kristen Gilbert now lives out her sentence in federal prison, her name etched into the dark ledger of medical betrayal. For the veterans she preyed on, and their families, her conviction offered accountability. But no true justice could ever undo the trust that was broken, or the lives that were lost. In the mid-1990s, whispers began to ripple through Glendale Adventist Medical Center in California. Patients in the respiratory ward were dying at unusual rates, often under the care of a soft-spoken night shift therapist named Efren Saldivar. He wasn't the stereotypical figure of menace. Colleagues described him as quiet, efficient, and even helpful with the heaviest caseloads. But then came the rumors. Staff began to notice that terminal patients in Saldivar's care seemed to die suddenly, sometimes without warning signs. There was talk of syringes, paralytic drugs, and a therapist who allegedly boasted, in private, that he had developed his own method of easing patients into death. Those boasts became more than idle gossip when Saldivar himself, in offhand conversations, admitted to co-workers that he had killed dozens of patients who were suffering too much. He framed it as mercy, but his co-workers were unsettled, not only by his words but by the number of deaths aligning with his shifts. Paralytics like Pavilon and succinylcholine were the substances most often mentioned. These drugs, when misused, could induce respiratory arrest almost instantly, especially in patients already dependent on breathing support. They left behind little forensic trace, making suspicions almost impossible to confirm. That was precisely what made Saldivar's confession so chilling. He seemed to know he could operate in the shadows. For years, suspicion swirled, but hard proof was elusive. Saldivar even left the hospital for a period, only to be rehired despite lingering doubts. Then, in 1990, police were called. During questioning, Saldivar gave a startling confession, claiming he had killed as many as 50 patients, maybe more, by injecting them with paralytics. But almost as quickly, he recanted. Defense attorneys later argued that the confession had been coerced. Without physical evidence, the case stalled. Families of the deceased demanded answers, while investigators scrambled to build something solid enough to hold up in court. Finally, prosecutors zeroed in on a handful of cases where medical records, death patterns, and drug access converged. Exhumations of former patients showed traces consistent with paralytics. Piece by piece, the walls closed in. In 2002, facing overwhelming circumstantial evidence and the likelihood of multiple murder convictions, Saldivar agreed to a plea deal. He admitted to 6 murders and received 6 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. For the families, the number 6 felt almost insulting compared to the scope of what he had once confessed. Dozens, even hundreds of potential victims. But the plea at least secured that he would never walk free again. The fallout was immediate. Hospitals across California reviewed drug access protocols. Respiratory therapists, once trusted almost without question, now faced stricter oversight. Glendale Adventist itself overhauled its policies, but the shadow of Saldivar's crimes lingered. To this day, his true body count remains disputed. Some investigators believe it could have been in the hundreds, making him one of the most prolific medical killers in American history. Others argue the evidence simply isn't there to support such a staggering figure. But one thing is clear. Efren Saldivar transformed whispered rumors into a national reckoning on how easily a trusted professional could exploit both access and trust. The Angel of Death, as headlines branded him, left behind not just a prison sentence, but a legacy of fear, a reminder of what happens when mercy becomes a mask for murder. When investigators finally sat down with Donald Harvey, they weren't prepared for what came out of his mouth. Calm, almost clinical, the man known as an orderly in Ohio and Kentucky hospitals described a career not of care, but of quiet killing. His methods? Tampering with food trays, injecting IV lines, smearing toxic substances on wounds, and sometimes even suffocating patients outright. Harvey insisted he wasn't a monster. He framed himself as an angel of mercy, claiming he only ended suffering for those already near death. But when prosecutors, journalists, and victims' families looked closer, that narrative cracked. Many of his so-called mercy killings involved patients who weren't terminal at all. Some were expected to recover. Others were simply in his care at the wrong time. The sheer range of his methods made him especially hard to detect. Cyanide-laced pudding, arsenic hidden in hospital meals, Pavilon and other paralytics slipped into IV drips. Even household chemicals like cyanide, arsenic, and rat poison were part of his arsenal. Colleagues often chalked up sudden declines to natural complications, never suspecting the soft-spoken orderly hovering in the background. Whispers trailed Harvey as he moved from hospital to hospital. Mortality spikes coincided with his postings, but back then, oversight was limited and turnover was common. By the time anyone connected dots, dozens of patients were already gone. It was only when Harvey himself began confessing, first to law enforcement, later in prison interviews, that the true scale of his crimes became visible. In taped conversations, he claimed responsibility for as many as 87 deaths. Other estimates, based on suspicious clusters, suggested the total could be over 100. But like many medical killers, Harvey's numbers remain clouded in ambiguity. Some families never received definitive answers. For investigators, each case was a battle between suspicion and evidence. In 1987, Harvey pleaded guilty to 37 counts of murder across Ohio and Kentucky, along with attempted murder and felonious assault charges. The plea spared him the death penalty, but ensured multiple life sentences. For many, the deal was bitter. Families wanted a full trial, a public airing of every suspicious death. Instead, Harvey quietly accepted a stack of life terms that guaranteed he would never walk free again. What makes Donald Harvey stand out, even among medical killers, is his candor. In interviews, he described the satisfaction of control, the ease with which he could act unnoticed, and the power he felt over life and death. To journalists, it was chilling, the voice of a man who cloaked murder in the language of compassion, but couldn't hide the thrill of domination. The legacy of Harvey's crimes reverberated through the hospital system. His case highlighted systemic blind spots, the lack of monitoring over controlled drugs, the ease with which staff could slip between hospitals, and the reluctance of institutions to confront suspicions head-on. Each failure gave Harvey more room to operate. In 2017, decades into his sentence, Harvey was attacked by another inmate in prison. He later died of his injuries, closing the chapter on his life but leaving his victims' families with little closure. The man who called himself an angel of mercy had instead become one of America's most notorious medical predators. Donald Harvey's story is a case study in contradiction, mercy versus murder, trust versus betrayal. And like Shipman, Cullen, and others in this series, his crimes force us to ask the most uncomfortable question: how many deaths in hospitals that seem unexplained might actually have human hands behind them? In the early 1980s, Southern California hospitals began noticing a disturbing pattern. Patients in cardiac wards, many of them stable or even on the mend, were suddenly collapsing without warning. At first, doctors chalked it up to complications. But whispers spread among nurses and orderlies. Too many deaths, too close together, and too many happening on the shifts of a single man. Robert Diaz, a registered nurse. Diaz was well liked on the surface. Colleagues described him as calm, capable, someone who could handle high-stress situations. But beneath that exterior, prosecutors would later argue, he harbored resentment toward patients he found difficult, disrespectful, or simply inconvenient. And unlike most nurses, Diaz had access to one of the most dangerous weapons in a hospital arsenal: Pavilon, a powerful paralytic. Pavilon is designed to temporarily stop breathing during surgery, only safe under precise control with ventilators. In the wrong hands, a single injection can silently suffocate a patient while leaving few immediate traces. And that's exactly what investigators alleged Diaz did, slipping Pavilon into 5 lines of patients during his rounds. As deaths piled up, some doctors began questioning the coincidences. Mortality spikes seemed to align with Diaz's rotations. Autopsies revealed traces of Pavilon in patients who had no reason to be receiving it. This wasn't sloppy medicine. It looked deliberate. By the mid-1980s, law enforcement built a case that linked Diaz to a cluster of at least 12 suspicious deaths. The trial that followed was one of California's most chilling. Prosecutors painted Diaz as a man who weaponized his medical training, turning a healing profession into a cover for serial killing. The defense countered with claims of weak evidence, arguing that residual drugs or contamination could explain the Pavilon traces. But the jury wasn't convinced. In 1984, Diaz was convicted of 12 counts of murder and sentenced to death. For decades, he sat on California's death row, maintaining his innocence. Appeals wound their way through the courts, challenging everything from toxicology protocols to jury instructions. None succeeded. The California Supreme Court upheld his convictions, leaving Diaz one of the few nurses in U.S. history to receive a death sentence for crimes committed in a hospital ward. The impact of Diaz's case went far beyond his fate. Hospitals across the state re-examined how they stored and monitored paralytics like Pavilon. Policies tightened around access, usage logs, and staff oversight. Diaz had exposed a gaping hole in medical safeguards. One determined insider could bypass protocols and leave a trail of bodies before anyone caught on. Robert Diaz died in prison in 2010 while awaiting execution. His death closed the book on his personal appeals but left open the broader questions. How many deaths before him had gone undetected? And how many after him might still slip through the cracks? In remembering Diaz, victims' families often stressed not just their grief but their disbelief that someone entrusted to heal could choose to kill. His story is a grim reminder that hospitals, places of recovery, can also become hunting grounds when oversight fails. And with Diaz, this series of medical predators finds its closing chapter. From Shipman in the UK to Cullen, Högel, and Gilbert in the US and Europe, the pattern is uncomfortably clear. When medical power is unchecked, it can be twisted into something lethal. Families still fight for transparency, reforms continue to evolve, but the scars left by these cases remain permanent. Across these 17 parts, we've walked through the shadows of hospitals and clinics, places meant to heal, yet twisted by a handful of predators into arenas of betrayal. From Harold Shipman's quiet house calls in England to Charles Cullen's night shifts in New Jersey, From Niels Högel's chilling code blue streaks in Germany to Robert Diaz's Pavlon trail in California. The stories were different in detail, but united in something darker. A pattern of trust violated. Every one of these medical killers thrived on the same foundation: society's instinctive trust in doctors and nurses. Families hand over their loved ones expecting care. Patients lie in beds, vulnerable, tethered to IVs, relying on staff they barely know. And it is in that sacred space of trust that killers like Genene Jones and Alit found their cover. Motives blurred the lines. Some claimed compassion, like Donald Harvey, masking murder under the word mercy. Others, like Genene Jones or Kristen Gilbert, seemed driven by thrill, control, or a warped need for attention. Shipman's motives, control, dominance, even financial gain through forged wills, shocked Britain. Cullen spoke of ending suffering, yet his randomness betrayed that lie. Högel admitted addiction to the drama of resuscitation. The truth is, no single motive can explain the scope of this betrayal. The reasons ranged from greed to ego, delusion to cruelty, but always at the cost of human life. Forensics and failures. These cases forced medicine and law to collide. Data mining exposed Högel's patterns years too late. Surveillance cameras trapped Lacey Spears tampering with her son's feeding tube. Toxicology linked Diaz to Pavlon. Paper trails caught Swango. But just as often, systems failed first. Administrators shuffled Swango from post to post instead of confronting him. Cullen moved between hospitals despite rising mortality clusters. Shipman practiced for decades, shielded by the very prestige of being a GP. Reforms, but scars remain. Some good did emerge. Britain tightened death certification after Shipman. Texas passed baby doe laws after Jones. Germany invested in data tracking after Högel. The VA restructured medication protocols after Gilbert. California hospitals changed paralytic storage after Diaz. Yet the families of victims know reforms came late, only after irreparable loss. And that's the chilling truth of this series. A white coat does not guarantee a pure heart. The overwhelming majority of doctors and nurses dedicate their lives to healing. But these cases show what happens when oversight breaks down, when red flags are ignored, when trust is weaponized. So, where does that leave us now? It leaves us with vigilance, with lessons carved in grief, with stories that demand remembering, not to sensationalize, but to remind us that medicine, like any field, is not immune to human corruption. In the end, perhaps the most haunting part of all is this: patients died believing they were safe. Families believed their loved ones were in good hands. And only later did the truth emerge, that the very people sworn to preserve life had written death into the charts. This was white coats, black hearts, the most evil doctors and nurses in history. If you made it here, tell me, which case struck you the hardest? And what do you think these stories reveal about trust, oversight, and the thin line between healer and killer?